it's working.
Hi, YouTube. Nice to see you.
No, it's still setting up. Oh, I need to set up as well. It's working.
Hi, YouTube. Nice to see you.
No, it's still setting up. All right. Good morning, Melanie. We got the YouTube thing done.
Yay.
Finally. The next problem that I'm noticing is that I have my pot of coffee, but I don't have a spoon, so I need to use a pen or something.
I quickly need to drink my coffee before.
This is some good YouTube entertainment for the crowds. I think we got everything in order. Would you like to test your slides before we get started?
Yes. My background a bit more clean. Okay. Let me close all my stuff.
All right. I'll also make you a co-host. There we go. Co-hosts all around. There we go.
One second, I'm just closing all my things that might do notifications.
All right.
Okay.
Also, Melanie, just so that you know, we do allow the audience to join in early. Huomenta, Meri.
Huomenta.
Yeah, the slides are working perfectly. Cool beans. You could show the slides where we have the breakout rooms so that Riina knows what to expect. Yeah, that one. And Riina, I have updated these questions. We had the old questions in the Excel. So now we have the ones.
Okay, great.
The next one is this.
Yeah. Was this also the final slide?
Yes.
Yeah, cool.
Excellent. Empathy during pandemic is intriguing topic.
Yes.
Huomenta myöskin Tiinalle.
Ja huomenta. Mä tulin tuonne niin ajoissa, että voin kokeilla koko minun ääni.
Ääni kuuluu hyvin.
Loistavaa. Kiitos. Hyvää huomenta kaikille.
Huomenta.
Ja muuten Tiina, kiitoksia teille jo ennakkoon. Tuossa on tosiaan se meidän yksi tiimi. Olettaen, että olet sama Tiina Lappalainen, joksi luulen, niin se meidän yksi tiimi tosiaan, niin se on kovasti innoissaan siitä, että saa teiltä apua, niin kiitokset siitä jo etukäteen.
Joo, loistavaa. Ihanaa, että päästään mukaan. Kiitos.
Jaakko, pystytkö heittämään mulle sen YouTube-linkin? Mä laitan sen Facebookiin.
Joo, pikku hetki.
Yes.
Pitäisi löytää se.
Joo, ei hätää.
Mistäs mä löydän sen?
Anna. Kiitos Anna-Leena.
Joo, mä löysin jo.
Hyvä.
Mä tsekkaan vielä, Lisbeth.
You also share it with me, Jaakko.
The YouTube link.
Yes.
Anna-Leena, do you have it at hand?
Thank you. I can just.
Yeah, it's there on chat. You can see it.
Now you're going to follow yourself almost live.
Yes, I've got it, like this.
The thing about YouTube, though, it's really annoying because it comes like, I don't know, 10 seconds later or something like that. So during the intermissions, when we try to interact with the YouTube audiences, it's weird because when I say something, it comes only 10 seconds later or something. It's almost impossible to react to anything that people say on the YouTube side.
Yeah.
Ja huomenta Laurallekin. Tervetuloa heräämään.
Kiitos, kiitos.
I could actually, Melanie, I could share you the slides that I will show so that you know what's my final slide. Also, I should probably have the slides at hand. Let me see. There we have it. in the recent weeks, I've been notorious in our team for having 3 displays, and whenever I try to share something, it shares something completely different. So I also need to practice a little
That's
bit.
why I decided to be on one screen only this morning, because I always struggle with, also with Max, there's these spaces, and then the moment I go on sharing on one, it somehow blacks the other one, and then I haven't figured out the perfect setup yet.
No, I also need to review, because what I'm going to share is just my desktop, and then I share from there. So I need to check if there's something super can't be shown stuff on my desktop. I don't think there is. Are you seeing my slides at the moment?
Yes.
All right. So I only have a few. We start here. Then we will go through some of the Zoom basics for people who don't use Zoom regularly. Then some information on what happens during the HERÄÄMÖ, so that people know to expect the breakout rooms, and for the YouTube audiences that we do have some intermission activities for them if they feel like it. Then we have our Sitra Lab crew introduction, and then I have my final slide, which is this one. And this is the final slide, but I do have quite a bit of stuff to cover here. I will briefly talk about the training program and how this HERÄÄMÖ collaborates with the training program, and then a couple of words about oh my goodness, I have way too much text here. A couple of words about ethics, empathy, and evidence, and then it's on to you. I will give a brief introduction of yourself, but you can do your own bio if that's okay for you.
Yeah, I have a, yes, I'll adjust it to whatever you say. So that's all right.
That should work.
And then it was approximately 23 minutes, right? I'm going to time
23, 25 in the ballpark.
I think the first part might be, I think the first part might actually be 25, and the second part is a bit shorter. So let's see how it.
Yeah, I will keep an eye on the clock, so we will know how to adjust.
And then if I'm, if the second part is a bit shorter, I mean, we have a couple of more minutes in the breakout rooms. So that's
that should be okay. We do try to keep the breakout rooms to the promised length of 10 minutes, because networking, it's important for the people who join the Zoom site. If people don't really enjoy the breakout rooms, then we will guide them to the YouTube live stream. Do I have a? I do have that. How do I? There's always this early morning. How do I? What is happening? Thing going on. Huomenta Juho ja Timo ja Anne. Ja sinne on tullut paljon porukkaa tässä välillä, kun mä oon testaillut slideja.
Huomenta.
Ja tervetuloa. Good morning to our international audiences as well. The spoken language of this HERÄÄMÖ is English, but usually before the HERÄÄMÖ we do a little bit of chit chat with our audiences, because there's a lot of people that we also know in person in the audiences. So don't wonder why we are doing all of our background stuff here live. And we are a couple of minutes away from getting started. Nyt on vielä hyviä aikaa hakea, tai no hyviä aikaa mä sanon 2 minuuttia. Mutta nyt on vielä 2 minuuttia aikaa hakea kuppi kahvia, jos ei ole sitä kerennyt tekemään. Miltä Sanna-Leena näyttää YouTuben puolella? Onko siellä ihmisiä?
Kyllä, 20 katsojaa tällä hetkellä.
Hyvä. Hei, tässä kun vielä odotellaan ennen kuin aloitellaan, niin meillä on tämmöinen lämmittelykysymys tuossa, että millä alalla tai missä yhteydessä sovellat muotoilun lähestymistapoja. Ja kirjoittakaa tuonne chattiin, että millä puolella muotoilua teette tai millä puolella pyritte sitä hyödyntämään. Se on meille myöskin mielenkiintoinen kysymys. Etenkin kun tänään puhutaan tuosta sosiaalisesta muotoilusta, niin se on oma muotoilualalajinsa. We do have a warm-up question here. What is the domain where you apply design process? And please do type in the chat where you use design or where you intend to use design in your work. You can write either in Finnish or English, if you will. We do prefer English in this HERÄÄMÖ. This is an English speaking event, but you can feel free to use Finnish as well. Oh my goodness. I have way too many screens open here at the same time. I'm struggling to find any information. We have 50 participants already online on Zoom. I think we have some in YouTube as well, so we are good to go in about a minute or so. Lisbeth, how many people did we have registered for this morning altogether in YouTube and Zoom?
We had quite many. I think altogether something close to 300. So let's see how many will find their ways online this morning.
Yeah, that is what happens. That's the thing about online events, that it's so easy to register on online events and then not joining in, which is, I mean, it's acceptable as well. I think we already have 60 people online here on Zoom and some more on the YouTube side. So I think we might want to get started to keep the schedule. Are we ready to go? Lisbeth, Anna-Lena, everything cool? Melanie? All right, I'm getting a green light, so let's go. It's 8:30. Good morning and welcome to another edition of HERÄÄMÖ, where today we will be focusing on design, and more specifically, we'll be focusing on social design. When you registered to this event, we were hoping that you join this session with at least some understanding of what design is. So you don't need to be a professional designer with extensive experience or anything like that, but we are hoping that you know your way around double diamond model and you have done at least some work where you involve your end users and stakeholders in your design work. So if you have a good grasp of those basics, I think you should be good to go. And as mentioned earlier, many people have joined since. You could share in the chat, what is the sector where you apply design in your work? Now, social design, it's one field of design, but you can be a service designer or graphic designer or industrial designer, whatever designer. There are lots of flavors to that one. Personally, my background is in service design and action research projects, mainly in the fields of education and welfare services. Thanks for asking. Now, before we get started with our keynote for this morning, we have all been stuck to our homes for quite some time, and most likely we are very familiar with how Zoom works. But if you are not, let's have a look at some of the basics. Now, when we are in the plenary, in the big room, please keep your microphones muted. We do have some breakout rooms coming up. Of course, during the breakout rooms, you can also open your microphones. Feel free to turn your video on as well. It's way easier to chat with people as we see their faces instead of just speaking to a bunch of different names on Zoom. We prefer using the Zoom chat window for comments and discussions. And whatever comments or questions you might have during the presentation, feel free to ask them in Zoom chat as well, because we also have our resident social designer Riina Pulkkinen online, and she will be looking at your questions, responding to them, and maybe picking some of the questions for the plenary later on. We will have a questions and answers session coming up later in this morning. A couple of tips and tricks for you to make the most out of this HERÄÄMÖ session. During the keynotes, you might want to switch on Zoom's speaker view, which you can do in the top right corner of Zoom window. That will allow you to follow the speaker instead of seeing all of the faces in the meantime, and have more of a focus on the slides themselves. For those of you who are new to HERÄÄMÖ, particularly for those of you who are on Zoom side, this is an interactive event, and we do encourage networking, meeting new people, maybe finding some new people to collaborate with in the future. So we do have a couple of breakout rooms scheduled for this morning. Those breakout rooms are, roughly speaking, 10 minutes a piece, and during the breakout rooms, you will meet a couple of new people. Hopefully, you might meet some familiar faces as well. But during the breakout rooms, remember to introduce yourself and tell the other people a little bit about yourself before you start actually discussing the topic of this morning. You will be meeting the same people in the second breakout room as well as in the first one, so you will get to meet them another time again later on during the session. Also use the chat to share any of the insights and questions that you might have, and we will curate your questions to our keynote speaker. This also goes to the YouTube. If you are following us on YouTube, good morning. If you have any questions, just pop them in there, and Anna-Lena will curate those questions to Zoom side, so you also get your voices heard. On the YouTube side, you won't be having the opportunity to discuss in breakouts, but we do have some intermission program planned out for you, so don't worry about that. Who is taking care of you this morning? I haven't even introduced myself yet. Good morning. My name is Jaakko Porokuokka. I work at Sitra Lab. Joining me this morning from left to right, we have Kirsi. Kirsi is managing social media this morning, tweeting like there's no tomorrow. Then we have Anna-Leena. Anna-Leena is there for you, for the YouTube audiences, taking care of the chat and hearing your comments and questions and whatever. Riina is living her dream life again, managing the Zoom chat over here. Myself, I will be working as the master of ceremony. And Lisbeth will be making sure that everything goes as planned and all of the tech works. Now, a couple of words about this HERÄÄMÖ. This is the second time that we are collaborating between HERÄÄMÖ and Sitra Lab training program. At the moment, we are running a training program with 10 teams enrolled, and these 10 teams, they are working on bottlenecks of democracy. And in short, our teams are taking a shot at making democracy work a little bit better for people who, for a variety of reasons, are left out some aspects of societal participation. So these groups, they might be marginalized people, they might be vulnerable people or underprivileged people. We're talking about people who are in religious minorities, they might have disabilities, or they might have language barriers, economical barriers, or cultural barriers, and so forth, and the list goes on. The common denominator here is that our teams are not trying to make a profit by improving the user experience or anything like that. What they're trying to do is they're trying to improve the conditions of different niche audiences. And that's why we are talking about social design this morning. To the benefit of our teams, many of them also have members aboard that represent their target audiences, these bottlenecks of democracy. And still, many of those people, they are not in the same condition as their target audiences. And in these situations, empathy plays a key role. And empathy is one of the key elements that we will be covering in this HERÄÄMÖ. Another element is evidence. That is something that we also need to take into consideration when we are designing for audiences that we can relate with, that we somehow belong to, we share a culture, or we share some sort of a position in the society with them. That's relatively easy. I say relatively easy. What I mean by that is that when we are designing for the audiences that we are not a part of ourselves, pushing away our assumptions is very important. And acknowledging one's biases is also vital. Then finally, we have the topic of ethics and responsibilities. And these are being discussed more and more in design. Now, design is being looked as one approach to manage wicked societal problems. And as this is the case, we as designers need to be on top of our game, understanding our responsibilities as designers, both during the design process itself and also in the outcomes that our designs result in. Melanie, I'm going to let you take the floor in a bit, just a heads up, but if I give a brief introduction of this morning's speaker. Now, Melanie, she's a designer and a strategist based in Helsinki. She has more than 12 years of experience in design. And she has been working on quality of care services and systems in maternal health and in developing countries for years. She's the founder of Sonder Collective, a co-founder. And before she started Sonder Collective, she was working for a company called M4ID as the director of service design and innovation. She was responsible for a massive portfolio of global health design projects. And she's no stranger to contemporary service design either. Before she started working with social design, she was working with Fjord and Accenture, designing and developing digital tools and services for the private sector. And we are super happy to have her here this morning. So, Melanie, if I stop my share, you can start yours and we can get going with the actual keynote.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Sitra, for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure to talk to you about social design, even though it feels a little bit weird to talk about social design when I have actually been for 1.5 years working from my living room. So it doesn't feel like it has been that social for me. But today, yes, I want to give you a little bit overview of my world of thought in how I think the social comes into design, some of the experiences that I've had working in the field and some takeaways for you. So how I have been structuring my thoughts is there's this conceptual and then there's a practical piece. So we're going to start with the conceptual piece, a little bit thoughts on social design, thoughts that have come to me over the years of experiencing working in this field. And then the second half, we're going to dive a little bit more concrete into, okay, what does it actually mean, evidence, empathy? And now I forgot already the third E on social design. So jumping into what is design, I want to kind of thank you, Jaakko, for the introduction, but I wanted to come a little bit back to my journey in design and how I have gotten here. Started for design for communication as a student, ended up designing interactions as an interaction designer in the private sector, all about human-computer interaction, thinking of, you know, how do we relate with technology? After which realized, okay, there are services we can actually design and think through how companies deliver their services. What are the interaction between customers and clients, which then grew into, oh, we can also design for business. And so kind of went into organizational design because companies that deliver services, they also need to design their business in the way to do that effectively. So it all became, okay, how do we design business to business and complex systems around that? Which then led me to the next thing. I was like, wow, okay, also healthcare systems are designed and you can actually apply design thinking, user and human-centered design to the way that, you know, nurses deliver services to their patients and clients. And right now, strongly on this journey to actually, you know, what is out there, what is outside of systems, you know, how can we design with people for society? And so how this journey kind of has come from, as you can see, a little bit micro problems in the abstract world, where it's actually things and, you know, services that humans have created, to actually a place where we're looking actually more at, you know, macro problems and problems of the real world is, right, is sustainable, is how do we allow how do we ensure equity? How do we ensure access to healthcare for everyone? And so I wanted to show this journey because I think all these elements that I come across from the micro to macro have been important learning pieces in this process on, wait, whoops, I need to learn to switch the slide. Here. Has been a process from, you know, if we think about design, being a skill set, a process, and a mindset, where when we work a little bit more on the micro side of things, the skill set is very important. It is you need to know the tools, you need to know how to draw wireframes, you need to know how to analyze workflows, you need to kind of manage working with people in the computer, you need to know the design process, you need to know, okay, when do I diverge in my thinking, when do I converge, how do I move people through a process? But of course, the mindset of design thinking is essential, right? In terms of, you know, how do I make sense of what I'm seeing and hearing, how am I translating that into experiences? And so from this journey, I think also the skill set and the process being very important in the early moments of this journey, the mindset has become more and more important. And it's something that I'm still educating myself on. And so I also want to invite you today on this journey with me on, you know, what are those things that I'm trying to fuel my mindset with, and I'm still on this journey. I'm still learning. I'm still a student of myself, a student of design myself. So I'm sure there's a lot of very experienced designers here in the chat. So I'm also curious to hear your perspectives and thoughts. So before we talk about you know, what is social design, I wanted to come back also like a little bit like what is design and how do we actually conceptualize this when we add the social on top, we have something to reflect upon. And so, you know, since the 60s and 70s, there has been a lot of scholarship around, you know, what is design, and it's been discussed as this third culture of knowing that sits between these two poles of of the sciences on the one hand and the humanity, where the science is, observing the facts of the world and counting them and saying, okay, I saw it, therefore it exists and I measure it. And the humanities on the other side, where it's about, storytelling, understanding experiences, how people make sense of the world, where the emphasis is on quality. And so design sits in the middle of these two worlds, trying to synthesize this best of human intention. And here the emphasis is on appropriateness. So how do I actually make sense of these two poles, so to say? You all probably, who have been in design, know these three kind of components that we are concerned in design with. Is feasibility, is it possible? Can this be done? Desirability, is it wanted? Will people want to use my service? And then viability, should we do this, or will it pay for our company? But now if we turn our kind of eyes to social design, we can think about social design not so much only about design of services or products or systems, but like to think of it of the creation of new social conditions, which is kind of quite abstract and vague. But when we think about it, social conditions in cities, could be even corporate culture communities, the key intended outcome is that of deeper cultural engagement, increased creativity, resilience of population and communities, equity, social justice, and of course, human health. So a little bit of a broader spectrum. So when we come back to these three questions around, what design is concerned with, when we think about social design, I would like to add these three questions on top of it, which is it effective? Does it help? And that's exactly how it turns to science. Is there actually, if we design an intervention in the healthcare sector or in the social sector, we need to know that, does it help? Does it do the trick? Is there impact? But then when you turn to the humanities, we also need to think about, is it appropriate? Is it actually right to do this? And this is where ethics come in place, and what we want to kind of talk about today a little bit more. And then finally, this question of accessible, which becomes very important in social design. Is it scalable? So when you come up with something that works for people, can I scale this up to the whole population? How can I make this accessible to as many people as possible? You all know the double diamond design process. And so these questions, I think, are important to keep us throughout this process. I like to add maybe two kind of little diamonds in the front and in the back, which in the front is determine, or can call it also intent, is where we actually, before we even start in the design process, really gather all the stakeholders and understand, who is who in this complex system, complex social system, and who has which agenda, what are we trying to solve for, before we even start with the actual design process. And the last diamond at the end being that of disseminating. So whatever we create, whatever we learn, put it out in the world, share it with others, because that's a key piece of social design, is that once we know a recipe for something that works, we don't put an IP on it, we don't sell it, but we actually disseminate it, make it accessible through academic papers, through case studies, workshops, or even capacity building to other groups and people. So if I would provocatively juxtapose service design and social design and see what are some of the differences, and you can critique that, happy for you to do that, throw your thoughts in the chat, where service design is often considered within the constraints of commercial activity within businesses. It's more affirmative. It's kind of, okay, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to design the solution that you asked me to do. Versus social design takes a more critical approach. It was like, no, I don't think that we should go down that route. We should be thinking something else. Service design being very focused on solving a specific problem. In social design, we often actually only get to the problem framing, because problems are very complex, and it's not necessarily that we ever got, and if we would have solved already all our social problems, we wouldn't be here speaking about social design, but it is actually the focus a lot on framing the problem right. It's from design for production that, this is a service I'm going to produce and then sell, to kind of designing for debate. So it's actually, how do I use what I learn in the design process to actually create a debate around, social equity, healthcare access, human rights, etc. From in the service of industry to in the service of society. And I think especially important when we use design tools, we often use customer journey maps, consumer stories, etc. So here we talk about citizens, we talk about people. So a focus from, a more kind of, labeled way of talking about people to actually who people are in the system at that moment. And finally, from a concern around user friendliness to ethics, again, ethics popping up as something we want to talk about. So I want to bring our attention a little bit, what is actually designed in social design. And I really like this image from Terry Irwin at Carnegie Mellon University, who kind of illustrated, the complexity of the problems we have in this world right now. And so if we look at what we designers design in companies, or in companies, often clear, simple problems. We can really say, okay, we can draw a line around that. This is my problem and this is your problem. I'm going to work here and you are going to work there. However, if we draw a bigger map of how all these problems, have maybe deeper roots into other problems, into complex, wicked problems, we actually see how intertwined these problems are with each other, and how hard it actually gets to solve any of this. And this is where the problem framing comes into place. It's not necessarily, okay, we're going to solve all of this mess, but it's actually, where are we drawing the line in terms of what we're solving for? So I want to give you an example, the clear, simple problem. I'm sure, LinkedIn and other feeds, WeForum, etc., have shared a lot of this designer who has designed this sleeping bag jacket for a homeless person, which is in itself a very good intention. And this person probably was very happy and content receiving such an aid to his dire situation. I would define this as a clear, simple problem. This person has been cold, this person has been suffering. I designed them, something that alleviates the need. But what is actually lying beneath is a system of social injustice, right? There's problems. Why are people living on the street? So the question is, what systems and what beliefs are we as designers actually supporting? Are we validating with our designs? And which are we challenging and critiquing? And so, in this case, and I'm sure that this guy who has designed this with his colleagues, they have a social enterprise and they do a lot of good stuff. I don't want to undermine this, but I wanted to use this as a provocative example to kind of, get us thinking. How do we think about who we are as designers? What position do we take? So in this case, there is a privileged designer working in a studio who has a house, who has a home, uses his skills to design something to keep an oppressed person comfortably in his position. And so is that actually, is that something we should challenge, or is it something that we should, support? And so what we can think about also here is, who's designing? So I just talked about, because there's the designer and then there's the homeless person. Would we think differently about whether this is good design or bad design if it would have been the homeless person, him or herself, designing this for himself, for the situation? Which makes us think, okay, am I designing from inside the system, or am I designing from outside the system? So the result might be the same, but I think it is how we look at the problem makes it very different. And so if we come back to this map of complex, complex problems, we have here the sleeping bag. I just wanted to bring up another kind of example around, social design, which is the housing first policy in Finland. But I don't know, maybe the sleeping bag has gotten much more attention on social media than the housing first policy, but this is actually a policy that tries to solve the problem of homelessness, through offering, through creating the system that people get access to houses first to get them off the street. So I find this quite interesting, juxtaposition in terms of what do we pay attention to? What do we design for? Do we design from inside the system, from outside the system? And who do we design, with and for? And we'll get to that in a little bit. and with that, I wanted to, throw out old quote by Eliel Saarinen, which many of you probably know. Always design a thing by considering it in its next larger context. A chair in a room in a house in an environment, and an environment in a city plan. And so you could, this Eliel Saarinen was an architect, and we could actually, apply this to social design. Always design, think about a person in a family in a neighborhood in a city, within a state, and then, a country within the world. What are all those relationships that person that I'm designing for with, has within the larger context? What is the political, the social context that I'm designing with? And so this is just an example of, again, Carnegie Mellon University works a lot with transition design, mapping the COVID-19 spread and response in the US. The map of the complexity of the problem didn't even fit on this slide. You can Google it yourself, but it's a massive map analyzing, what all led to the COVID-19 spread going back into the 1800th century. And so understanding, the complexity of the timeline as well as the depth in terms of, different sectors all kind of coming together to create one problem actually helps us to put them in front of our stakeholders and think through what are those entry points that we are using to start solving for some of those at least. So when we then think about social design and coming back to the sleeping bag versus the policy, something that always kind of helps to think through are matrices. So here's another matrix. Project and individual. So I would put the designer who is like designing the sleeping bag on the bottom left corner has designed his little sleeping bag, and then maybe the policy is somewhere interdisciplinary system there in the middle. But we can also do cross-sector collaborations on cultural transformations. That kind of concerns aspects around human rights, paradigm shifts, and how we think about how we value life, how we value healthcare, etc. So on the bottom left corner, again, the solution or the problem might be more defined and the solution quite clear. The role that the designer takes here is that of the expert. I use my skills and my process. I'm going to produce you your solution. And the designer is the producer. So I'm actually creating the outcome of the design. Versus when we move up there, we're moving towards undefined problems, unclear solutions. And then what happens is the designer is actually only one ingredient. And I think that's a tremendous shift for somebody designing in this sector. Suddenly, I'm not this expert anymore because I'm actually learning and absorbing lots of things from social scientists and politicians and nurses and social workers. And my role goes away from actually producing the solution to actually translating between those different stakeholders, using my skills of visualization, simplifying complex, situations, using human language to kind of translate and negotiate a dialogue between those different parties. And so this transition, it takes a lot of time, it takes effort, and it takes dedication to kind of, and it also, of course, a will to move there. Which brings us to who designs. I want to take a little bit of, a few minutes to think through a little bit more than who actually designs in social design. And I really like this quote from 3RU. The success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. I pay attention, therefore it emerges that way. Which brings us also already to the topic of bias. How I get up in the morning, how I feel about myself as a designer on that morning. I walk into a workshop, I facilitate a meeting with stakeholders. How I feel that morning, what are my experience and sense, will change the course of how my design process pans out. So we always need to be aware how much power is in our interior condition when we start intervening in a system. And I don't mean now we as designers, but we as project teams. So if we have bad team dynamics, if we have a difficult team, it will reflect. And so this is something we need to analyze, be aware of, and also use as a way in the process to kind of constantly check in, what is it that I'm paying attention? Am I paying attention to this problem, or am I paying attention to this person? And therefore, the course of my intervention takes a different direction. The 4 voices of design is a way for us to think through who do we always need to have in a design process when we design in the social space. And we have here the voice of experience, the voice of intent, the voice of expertise, and the voice of design. The voice of experience is coming from the community, the people that are actually exposed to the problem. So if this would be around homelessness, we would make sure that the voice of the experiencing homelessness is included in our process. The voice of intent refers to actually the person, the institution that wants to do something about this problem. This might be the government, this might be an NGO, because the vision of the agenda, the vision, the political philosophy of that institution hugely determines the course of the intervention, and it needs to be heard. So it's not that in human-centered design we only listen, to the people that we want to kind of serve or improve their lives for, but we also need to include the stakeholders on the top, because if we don't manage to bring these voices together, we will fail. The voice of expertise, that who else has something to say in this process? Is this the social scientists who have been researching homelessness for many, many years? Or do we want to infiltrate, a futurist thinker, someone who kind of brings a complete new perspective? And then the voice of design is us, the designers, who kind of need to bring the voice of ensuring that all these voices are being heard and come to the table together. So this is a good kind of way to check ourselves. Are we actually including all the voices that need to be heard? And then we come actually to, the core of social design, when we move from designing to and designing for to designing with. And I think it's always good, and I'm still checking this with myself, often we end up designing to and designing for. We run a couple of interviews, we have a workshop, we ask a few people, to create some ideas with us, but then we forget about them. And then we design our thing and then we launch it. We will keep you informed, we will listen and acknowledge. It means we're actually just informing or consulting people. But true collaboration and then empowerment, when we're actually designing with people, looks very different, because there we need to change our mindset. So we will look to you for ideas and then incorporate it. So no matter whether I like that idea or I think it, makes sense of them, we are actually taking the ideas created by the people and kind of making a solution out of it, and empowering, moving to, we will implement whatever you decide, which is, I think, the aspiration of all of us working in participatory design, that we as designers are the pure facilitators in this process. And what is important to think through here is who, again, coming back to kind of where are we designing from within, is that who am I accountable to when I design for a problem? Most of us work in companies and we have a boss, and then we work in a company that has shareholders. And then so we might be, as a company, delivering a service or social service to an NGO. That NGO gets money from a funder. So suddenly we need to think about is, I need to please my boss. I need to make sure I do this work in the right amount of time to please the shareholders. The shareholders have their own interests and strategies and directions. The NGO has its own agenda. They need to please the funder. The funder has its own strategy and direction. And then so it makes you actually think, how as a designer within these complex networks of competing agendas and interests, how can I stay true to the problem? And foremost, how can I actually have that direct link and connection with the people that I want to design with? And so this is actually a provocative question to the industry, is how do we ensure that if we do social design, we get out of this network of entangled dependencies and get the designer closer to the community? And I need one more minute. And so I think finally, I want to kind of share a few thoughts around, bias and how it influences our choice when designing. And so we all carry biases all the time in our work. And we often forget about it. And I think that's actually a huge mistake, because this creates errors, right? We're excluding people if we are not aware of the bias that we're carrying with. Some of you might have read this book, which talks about how the world has been designed on data that's been collected out of mostly a male kind of cohort. And so women have been excluded from city planning and design, etc. So there are lots of examples how actually the bias in the world kind of drives a lot of decisions, and it's excluding people. So I've just put here a few examples of, confirmation bias, conformity bias, anchoring bias, some of which we're all carrying with us at all times. And so whenever we go on into a social design process, it's very important for us to detect those biases. Let's not feel ashamed of them. They sometimes might feel uncomfortable for us, oh, we're a fully female team designing for a population, so we're missing the male perspective, or the other way around. And so we need to be aware who's in the room, what biases do we have, how do we approach the design process from this perspective. And once we see those gaps, we can actually do something about it. We can say, okay, once we have our solution, we admit, yes, this has been 5 women thinking through this solution, but maybe we need to do some additional interviews. Maybe we need to include another advisor, that brings a male perspective to our problem, etc. as a simple question. So with all of this that I've been just going through around in the system, out of the system, what are our accountabilities, what are our biases? I want to end with this slide on social design is always political. And as designers, we need to dare to be political. We need, we work within a system that makes political choices around whether people have access or not, whether we include or exclude people. And I want to leave you with these 3 quotes that I think highlight this polarization that we think about what are the opportunities of design, but also what are the limitations. The designer's stance is experimental and proactive. It helps us propel beyond merely addressing existing problems with existing forms into imagining entirely new terrains of possibility. So here we are, we can imagine the world anew. However, designers' understanding of innovation and creativity are often entangled with the reproduction of the capitalist and colonial status quo. Questions of class, gender, race, and coloniality are notoriously absent from most design theory and practice, and so is that of design's dependence on capitalism. So these are kind of huge accusations to the design community. How do you deal with this? So this is the end of my talk. So I wanted to throw over to Jaakko and leave you with this question around what are the biases or these invisible power structures that govern your way of thinking or designing? We'd be curious to hear.
Thank you, Melanie. So that was the end of the part 1. We still do have the part 2 coming up, and this is quite a big question. I think this might be a good time to open up the breakout room. So Lisbeth, are you all done with those?
Yes, the rooms are ready to go.
All right, so we will give you 10 minutes to have a look at these questions. What are the biases or invisible power structures that govern your way of thinking or designing? And those are rooms of 4 people. And for the people in the YouTube, just give me a moment and I have something prepared for you as well. Melanie, will you be joining the breakout rooms as well?
Yes.
All right, so one of the lucky rooms will have Melanie there as well. So go ahead, Lisbeth, let's take a 10-minute time for people to discuss what they have just heard. And we are asking for the audience on the YouTube to have a bit of patience because this takes a minute. In the meanwhile, let me set up my slides here. I do have something for you to do. Of course, you can also go and get another cup of coffee or just walk around or take a break or whatever. But I figure that for you who are there sitting on your computers and have nothing to do for the upcoming 10 minutes or so, I do have something for you as well. So Melanie was mentioning a few things about biases that we bring to our work. And now I need to juggle with all of my Zoom windows and PowerPoint windows and whatnot. There we go, then I can share my screen. So I prepared a little bit of a Mentimeter thing for you to check out. There we go. Melanie picked 3 different cognitive biases that might have an impact on our work as designers. And Lisbeth, you are very familiar with these ones. So if you want to comment, feel free to do so. But Melanie picked these ones. So we have confirmation bias, we have conformity bias, and then we have the anchoring bias that might have an impact on your work or not. And my question to you is, do you feel like these are important in your work? And if they are easy to identify and address or not? So if I go through all of these a little bit. So first we have the confirmation bias. What confirmation bias means is that each one of us, we do have our own worldview and we do have our own beliefs and so forth. But what we tend to do as human beings is we look for evidence that supports our worldviews. So if we see something happening, we use that to reinforce our own thoughts instead of curiously wondering what might that thing be about. So if we have some sort of an assumption, we do strengthen that by the signals that we get from our environment. Then we have the conformity bias. Now, what conformity bias means is that in situations where we are surrounded by a majority that thinks differently than we do, we tend to align our thinking with the thoughts of that majority, even if it's against our personal judgment. So for example, if you start in a new organization and that organization thinks very differently about some fundamental in the world, you don't necessarily agree with that, but you start adjusting your thinking to that direction. And this also goes into smaller teams and well, on the society as a whole, really. And finally, we have anchoring bias. And anchoring bias means that we have some sort of early knowledge of something. If I give you an example, a classic example of anchoring bias, this means that, for example, you are going to buy yourself something new, and then you hear some sort of a price, and you anchor to that price, and then your thinking starts kind of revolving around that anchor. So you have some sort of a new piece of information or something. You don't have any better information. You start as that as a starting point, but you never really let go of that. Another example of this would be in a situation where you started a new work or something. You get provided with some information, you anchor yourself to that and are unable to let go and kind of focus on that anchor. So that's what anchoring bias really is about. It's commonly used in financial decision making on pricing and so forth and so forth. But if you go to menti.com and use this code here, 45120846, there are a couple of questions kind of, do you consider this to be important? And then there's another question of how easy do you find these things to acknowledge in your work? You have about 6 minutes to do so. Lisbeth, are you still working on the breakout room issues?
Yeah, I think think everything is okay with the rooms. We have some people who have not joined, but everyone has been assigned a room, I think. Yeah.
Hi, Rina. I was in a room. Nobody was talking, so I had to leave and come back to the main room.
Oh, that's a shame. Would you like to go to another room, maybe?
Okay. Yeah.
I can put you in another room, and let's hope there will be some people who talk.
All right.
Just 1 second.
Thank you.
This thing would never happen if we would meet face to face. Like you would go to a small table with some people and start talking to them, and then they would be just silent. Like,
yeah.
That's one of the hindrances of working online. I've also been wondering, kind of, there are very different cultures when it comes to discussing online. And well, within our teams, we always have our microphones and cameras on, and we discuss it. And by many cases, people come from organizations where no one ever puts their camera on and stuff like that. It's kind of, it's a thing. By the way, I want to have a check at the chats. I've seen that Zoom chat at least has been super active. There have been some interesting discussions going on as well. Anna-Leena and Riina, what is going on in the chat? Are there any questions in the YouTube side that we need to bring on to the plenary on Zoom, or what's happening in the Zoom chat?
well, a lot is going on, but especially the kind of like the spectrum of public participation from like basic participation to empowering got us quite hyped in the chat, and I think that like there are many questions around it, but like around power structures, and Katja, for example, is saying that we will implement what you decide is still a power structure. Could it be we will co-implement together, and are our structures ready for this way of working? So kind of like the question of like, is empowerment still a bit like a wrong word? Like, could it be like co-power? And like, what would that mean in practice is the most, like, I think that was a question of like that got many excited or somehow yeah.
That is actually a huge one, and we were discussing when we were preparing this session with Melanie. We were discussing this topic, and it's the situation where people can actually implement what the people decide. It's very specific, and typically it's kind of, it only happens in certain types of financing instruments, or in situations where people are designing for themselves and kind of not necessarily financing, but kind of taking the responsibility of the whole project that they are working on, kind of citizen level activism. That's where it happens, but it rarely happens in other conditions.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, it's understandable. It's understandable because typically there is some sort of founder, or there is some sort of financer or client or something.
It's a question of like who has the initiative of, again, what was here in the chat, who has the initiative that to kind of also to take the first step, like this has to be fixed. This is a problem that we need to tackle.
So we will have a lot
tackling problem
afterwards.
Yeah.
How much time do we still have for the rooms?
We have 1 minute and 15 seconds, so you need to start closing the rooms in about 10 seconds now.
Yeah, great. Are you going to share the Menti results, by the way?
I will share those during the second breakout. This is for the YouTube audiences.
Great.
I will actually hide them at this stage.
Okay, sounds good.
I don't know if there are any results. We will see, I guess.
Yeah.
I hope so, because there's quite a lot of discussion on YouTube, and there's actually, well, probably the most
Please, but did you
difficult one.
start closing the? You did, yeah.
So the most difficult question on YouTube is there are at least 2 people bringing it up, that these biases, it's very difficult to acknowledge them. So how to do that? That is actually the whole question, but that's the main problem for people.
I do actually, in design, I do have an article from Sean Lietka. I think it's from 2016, if I remember correctly. So it's not the latest, but I mean it's only like 7 years or so. There was this one article that kind of covered some of the cognitive biases and how to tackle them in design through methodology. It's not open access, I don't think, but I can see if it's on her website or something like that. She had some examples of how to do just that. But yeah, it's super difficult. That's something that requires reflection as well. And the breakout rooms are closing in awkward silence. But the nice thing about closing the breakout rooms is that we actually get to see about 50 faces at one time, which is also always super cool. Melanie, you are there? I can see you. So while you are shifting gears back to presenting, because you were just discussing with people, I can briefly say what's happening on YouTube at the moment. There was actually, I hear that there was some discussion about the cognitive biases and how difficult they are to address in design work and in general as well. And I remember this one article by Sean Lietka that was covering some of these topics, but this is something that we might want to get back to later during the Q&A. But Melanie, I will let you take charge again. Let's keep going.
Thank you. Okay, just checking. Are you seeing my presentation?
Yep.
Great. Okay. Great discussions in the breakout rooms. In the following 15 minutes or so, I want to share still some, practical lessons on social design. And as we already talked earlier, we had these 3 E's: evidence, empathy, and ethics. So I wanted to just talk a little bit around, why they are so important in social design and how they relate to each other. And I want to start. So evidence, I call design with data. Empathy, I call design with heart. And then ethics, I call design with responsibility. And I actually have put empathy in the middle for a reason, because I think that it's how we use our empathy is, needs and is strongly influenced, by using reason and data and science on the one hand, but also, like breaking sometimes, breaking is a wrong word, but kind of, pushing us a little bit back, thinking responsibility, like, is this ethical, what we're doing? And so I think there's also this line around, I think these are all intertwined and kind of actually influence each other. And I think in social design, we need to find the right balance in between designing with data, designing with the heart, and designing with responsibility. So for each of those, I want to share a few thoughts with you around ethics. And so in social design, we very often work with marginalized, vulnerable, or even underprivileged groups. We might, my work has been working a lot with communities and groups in sub-Saharan Africa, a little bit of India, but also a little bit of work here in Finland, and so those moments when we get into those situations, again coming back to bias, we come from very privileged places. We have received an education, we live in a house, we have a profession, we can travel, we have seen the world, we continuously educate ourselves. So suddenly we jump into another world where people have not had those experience and privileges, and we're kind of meeting. And so we really need to think about what that kind of encounter means, and how do we, how do we run this process in a way that respects people who may have not had the voices or have not even learned to express what they think they want, what they kind of need. And so when we suddenly come with our design process there, and we interview them, and so we take a lot of emotion. We put a lot of emotional burden on some of these groups. In some cases, if we might be talking to victims of sex trafficking, we might talk to people who have experienced domestic violence, we might talk to people who have had birth complications. And so the moment we, as designers, we talk to them and we are curious, to learn about the experience, we actually might reignite, some trauma, some really bad experiences. And then so what do we do with this situation? We go away and do our design process, and we leave the person in shatters at their home. Or then sometimes the situation also comes up that this moment that somebody actually gets to share their story is an incredibly catalytic moment for them. And then so you've actually opened up a box, and then but you disappear. And then what does this, what can people do with this moment when they suddenly started, okay, I actually have feelings, I can communicate to them, to someone, and suddenly you have disappeared. So we need to follow a set of ethical guidelines and standards when we do social design, and we encounter people from different contexts and cultures that we have not understood. And that's something we also get back to when we talk about empathy. And so I personally recommend a lot to take an ethical training and actually work with anthropologists and social scientists and other kind of professionals who have actually been doing this work for years, and kind of learn from them, work with them, and also take a step back when we realize sometimes our curiosity as designers drags us into situations that we know should not go. Sometimes, I could find myself in a slum outside of Kenya, wanting to go and interview that woman that had a terrible experience because it might inform the design process. But I may need to say, no, I don't do this now, because it's not my place to enter this house and come there as a white person listening to the story. I'll send a local researcher instead, because the way that these two people from the same culture and community could encounter could be different than me intruding from the outside. Comes back to this question of inside and outside again. Sometimes the outside perspective is great, but we always need to ask ourselves, is it ethically correct to actually go into that moment? The other thing is adjusting design tools and methods culturally to the context. And I think that comes again back to, we think that, we are using all these creative tools and that makes people playful and enjoy. And sometimes these tools don't work. And then we need to get creative. And so how do we actually get this conversation going, or how do I get this person to think through with me in a way that works? You can see here, I usually like to use these Dixit storytelling cards to open interview situations and have people share a little bit, which card resonates with you and what do you see on the card, and tell me a story about it. And then, a designer can post a picture on the internet, say look what creative methods I'm using, but I'm actually showing this picture here to you because it hasn't worked, because it actually was very difficult being in a house where I was talking to a woman who was so vulnerable and had experienced terrible things in her life. She could not see anything on those cards and she could not relate. And she was asking me, and she got a little bit even nervous, saying what do I do with this? I don't see, I don't understand. And then so we had to take them away and find a different way. So I wanted to share this as an example. Usually you share examples of, this is this creative method and this, but we really need to kind of be careful in what we assume other people can do and what we project in what other people can engage with us. So on the ethical part, I think very important to always protect the people that we work with, and only go as far as they allow you to go, and not let us drive our designer curiosity in a direction that we shouldn't go. So using informed consent and ensure data protection. For example, the pictures we take, we ensure that you actually don't see the faces, and we don't share any data of people when we create, because a big part of our design is to share stories, right? And to share actually what people experience, but at the same time, we need to protect their privacy, we need to respect their story. And so how do we find that balance in between bringing this voice up that we talked earlier about, but also protecting the people that we're working with? So then some thoughts on evidence. A design process for us, we think about creativity, and we think that, okay, we get in a room, we ideate, we get inspired by interviews, and then the designer does the magic in the head and we come up with a solution. But in social design, we also need to think about a rigorous process, rigorous in terms of, what has led to which decision in the design process, and how can I back up what I have designed? Because when we start designing for communities, for populations, you have a huge responsibility that this thing works for everyone. And so we can't just use one interview of one person. Oh, this person said, I would like to have this, and therefore I design it. But what is actually the data that backs me up that I know that actually most people want this? Or this works for those people and this thing works for those people. So we use quantitative, but also qualitative data in the design process to kind of make those decisions. Sometimes we rely, on quantitative data that is already accessible, like survey data or, medical guidelines, etc., that have been research tested, and things are known in a scientific sense that inform our design process. And so we need to bring these two kind of data pieces together, our stories from the ground, the experiences of people, and make their voices heard. And then we need to back it up with data that we can go actually to the government, or we can go to the institution and say, listen, I have evidence that, this is working and this is what we should be doing. And therefore, it is very important that in our design process, we document. And this is something I think that distinguishes, again, service design from social design a lot, is that we need to document our design decisions. Why have I made this decision? How do I back it up? So that after a year, I can go back and say, hey, I know that because of these 15 interviews we conducted, I know that this was the key theme we needed to work on, and this is what we're going to do. And then the second piece around, there's using evidence to inform the design process, but then there's also creating evidence. So once we make a design, we create a solution, we work with the community, can we create evidence that can be shared with others? So, how do we measure, our intervention? How do we, again, comes back to dissemination. Can we create evidence that their change has actually happened, and can it be shared with others? So if we want to scale this, from one city to another city, we know what has actually led to the success. Was it the process? Was it the type of stakeholders involved? Was it the methods we used? Was it, the designer's specific ideas? But which ingredients actually led to the change that we created? Document that, and disseminating that will help other groups to do something similar. And finally, coming to the topic of empathy. And I actually have a little bit of a split feeling about empathy, because empathy is celebrated in the design world as the magic ingredients that we have that makes us design great things. But I would actually argue that we're not so good. We're often not that good with our empathy, and maybe we're not using empathy actually, in the right way or as we could. And so we need to be careful when we talk about empathy in design. Because when you actually go into a community and you work with social workers that work with the population there every day, I think they have much better empathy than me, who goes in there and talks to 3 people and interviews them and then thinks like, wow, now I know how these people feel and what they need. So again, thinking like empathy doesn't mean that you need to, you know, fully have that, but again, you can invite other people into your design process who maybe can carry that empathy also. And so empathy is not sympathy. Sometimes we go through a design process like, I really like to ideate with this person, but do I actually really know how this person feels? So something that is important to think, and that empathy is not a special skill of just a designer. Some of us have more of it, some of us has less. Is something we can, you know, train, but it's not something that's only exclusive for us designers. Empathy can also lead us to do wrong, unethical things. And that's coming back to what I said earlier. If my curiosity as a designer, like I really want to talk to these 4 people because they have so interesting stories that could like improve my design process. That's a very egocentric way of thinking about the design process, because it's actually only fueling my own feeling. It's actually not thinking about, do I really understand, you know, it comes back to the ethical question, should I really, you know, do this in this moment? So we need to always kind of check in with this moment. Also, our ability to empathize is directly tied to socioeconomic status. And I put here this study that has shown that, you know, the more economic privilege a person has, the less empathetic understanding they show when they're relating to others. And so if this is already a known situation, what steps can I actually take in a design process to expose myself more with the problem? And so this really goes deep into, you know, using ethnographic methods. Can I live in a community for a week? You know, just going and doing some interviews and running a few workshops will not be enough to really understand from the problem. And that is where we are going from designing for to designing with, is that actually if you bring people along in your process, you know, you can have them talk about what they want and what they need and make the design decisions, and you don't need to do that for them. So often empathy, I think, is used in design when we're actually not with the users and we need to make design decisions on their behalf. But when we actually bring people along in the participatory process, then maybe empathy actually takes a backseat because you have the people who can make the decisions in your design process. So here I'm sharing that empathy is a different tool when we design for versus when we design with. And so the last, I think, 2 pieces that I think are important to think around empathy is it gives us the responsibility to act. So once, as an example, as part of a 2-year project that we're doing in Kenya, we have interviewed over 80 people and we've heard their stories. And those stories are still sitting with me every day. And I feel the need to do something. You know, we're designing and we're moving our process forward, but it actually gives you the responsibility that something needs to come out of this process so that the time that these women have spent sharing their stories actually leads to something. So it gives you actually quite a big responsibility, and sometimes it weighs quite heavy on your shoulders. And that's something I think to be aware of. And so it means also that it requires commitments to the problem on a long term, because many of these social issues that we work with, they are not solved overnight. They're not solved in a 3-month design sprint, but they take 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. And so I think my advice is that if you're working in the social space, it is a long-term commitment, and it's good to commit to a specific problem or issue or solution, because you continue to learn and you continue to grow your depth of understanding, and you also kind of find different avenues and ways to work with the issue. And so finally, I think to say around empathy is that rather than using it as a decision-making tool, I think as the social designer has the responsibility to bring those unheard voices out and kind of share them with the decision makers. So for example, it is bringing, if you spend some time within a community and you have talked to a very vulnerable group of people, it's very unlikely that the funder of a certain solution or, is going to ever, necessarily speak with the people that you have talked to. So again, how can you translate what you have heard? How do you can give justice to what you've heard on the story and the needs that they have up to the decision makers that make decisions? And that's where our design skills come in terms of, creating journeys, making day in the lives, creating kind of design profiles that really bring out those nuances and that make the decision makers feel different about how that they need to do something about the problem. And I think that is where empathy is key as social designers in this process. So coming back for 1 minute to this overview, I would say that designing with the heart, we all design with our hearts, right? Because we want to be passionate about what it is, but we need to, sometimes we need to stop ourselves. We need to put a little bit of science in the background to back us up. And on the other hand, we really need to think about the ethics piece and think like, is it what we're doing really supporting? Is it protecting the vulnerable groups and communities that we work with? So keeping that always on the left and right of your heart, I think is important. So I hope that this gave you still a little bit of kind of food for thought around how to apply social design in practice. And I have another question for you. What role has empathy played during the pandemic? And where has it worked for the purpose of design?
Thank you, Melanie, for the second part. And to respond to the question that Melanie has posed here, I think we will take another session of breakout rooms, and I don't want to shorten the breakout room, so we'll give you another 10 minutes. I think the breakout room discussions at this point are quite important because Melanie promised some provocative questions and she delivered. So, Lisbeth, do you have the breakout rooms ready?
Yes, they are ready to go.
All right, let's go. 10 minutes. And while Lisbeth is juggling with the breakout rooms, we are still live on YouTube, so I will actually show you some results from the earlier Mentimeter thing that we had. These are a little bit anticlimactic, these results, though, but I will share them regardless. I might be sharing my screen. Kirsi, Riina, Anna-Leena, are you seeing? Yeah, okay, cool. So what we have here is this is the weighted average of each of the responses. And as you can see, they cluster here quite nicely. So if you look at first number one, the thing is that all of these appear to be vital to acknowledge. We can see a little bit of background data here as well. So if I hover over the confirmation bias, we can see quite a lot of diversion in terms of how easy these things are considered to be detected. And I think this goes to all three of these, but we do have some hierarchy here. Not that much though. And these are only kind of three different elements that we have in regards to cognitive biases, which means that they are indeed important and something that people need to pay attention to. I think Riina and Anna-Leena, we do have, after the breakout rooms, we do have about 10 minutes of time for everything that we have left, which is questions and answers. So we could have a look at some of the questions from YouTube as well, and then from the Zoom, see if there are any themes going on. So Anna-Leena, what's happening on the YouTube side? Are there any major themes that we should cover in the Q&A?
Thanks, Jaakko. Not so many, actually, no questions at the moment, but there is still time. So if someone wants to pop out a question, then we'll see. But yeah, maybe on chat, on Zoom chat then.
We
Yeah,
got
do have 8
excellent
minutes.
questions in our Zoom chat. So yeah, I can at least questions from Stine and Hanna-Rita and Rita. So yeah.
So you have your
Actually,
set of questions.
How much time do we have since we got so many good questions?
We have about, let's see now, if the breakout rooms they close in 7 minutes, then it'll be about 10 to 10. You have our feedback thing going on. I think what I will do is I will have the feedback thing rolling right away after people come back, and then we will take the questions and answer in the meanwhile. So that will give us a little bit of time as well.
A quick question, would anyone in the main room still like to join a breakout room?
Yeah, sure. Why not? I was in a breakout room, but it was very quiet over there, so I came out.
Okay. Well, would you like to go to another room?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
All right. Wait just 1 second. I'll find your name and put you in another room.
We still have about 6 minutes to go here. There was an also in the chat about the thing that we mentioned earlier, that there are different cultures where people don't necessarily use their microphones or cameras or so. And some people mentioned that they choose to do that because there are other people in the room and they want to respect their privacy, as you should. Yeah, that's a good point. Oh, by the way, Anna-Lena, did you get the link? I sent the link to the article that I mentioned.
Yes, and I shared it on YouTube. And we have one person on YouTube posting that there is this video called Unconscious Bias at Work by Google Ventures. It can be found on YouTube, and she recommends it, that it should be very interesting. And it's about how to detect and deal with biases, and very hands-on type of video. So
Unconscious bias at work.
Unconscious Bias at Work, yes, on Google Ventures.
All right, need to check that one out. The article that I linked, I mean, I'm not sure if it's open access or not. I mean, you can find it easily if you want.
Yeah.
I linked the Wiley online library link for the people who have access to Wiley. We have 5 minutes to go. I think I will take a super brief break just to keep myself comfortable. I've been sitting here all morning, so Lisbeth, if you make sure that everything rolls smoothly, I'll be right back. We have about 4.5 minutes of breakout rooms going still.
But you should be doing the proper chat host things and like chatting without chatting just by yourself without seeing nobody. Maybe something about the weather or about the ethics of design or.
Yeah, design is not really a strong suit of mine, but maybe you could try.
Yeah, it's an easy small talk topic. The ethics of design. Go.
You are a social psychologist, so those are kind of the biases and all of that. That should be your bread and butter, really.
That's true. There was some familiar stuff too, but also new stuff. This has been really interesting to me, that I must say.
That was super interesting session, and the reason why I wanted to ask Melanie to join is because basically what I have done myself is I've done design only in Finland, and kind of my most I can't say difficult audience, but kind of audience that I know the least about, and that was the most challenging for me. So actually senior citizens living in care homes, and this is an area that I really found it difficult to relate with these people, and kind of it took a lot of kind of background research and just spending some time with these seniors, getting to know kind of how do they think, what are the things that they focus on, what are the important things for them. And what we were doing when I was working with them was we were introducing service robots to social services. So there's a lot of kind of mixing ideas and kind of ethical questions there as well. Of how do we implement robotic solutions and artificial intelligence, stuff like that, to such an environment where it's so foreign. So that was a difficult one. We need to start closing the breakout rooms in about 40 seconds or so.
Okay, just tell me when, so I post them.
In 34 seconds. I will give you a heads up. I need to take my slides.
I just want to mention briefly that we are going to share the slides afterwards in Sitra Lab website, right? And on top of that, there are some excellent Twitter notes by Lari and Marika in Twitter. So if you put hashtag HERÄÄMÖ to your Twitter search, you will find great notes there, and there's also some screenshots of the slides. So not just the slides, but actually some reflections as well. So excellent buzz in HERÄÄMÖ in that sense as well, in Twitter.
It's probably a sign of good discussion when no one is rushing back from the rooms.
Definitely.
Which is, I mean, it's fair as well just to sit and wait, especially at this hour.
Yes.
Marika, now when I can see your video, I was just preaching your tweets to our YouTube audience. So thanks for active tweeting. Excellent notes.
I think everyone is back from the breakout rooms, and we do have our questions and answer coming up. If you have any questions that you would like to ask Melanie, just pop them in the chat and Riina will curate some questions from there. In the meanwhile, just to stay on schedule, I have shared my screen, so you could go to menti.com and use the code 37186356, so that you can see on the screen. And if Lisbeth, you can write that code in the chat, then people can just copy paste that one from there. There you can share your thoughts on why this was important for you or your organizations. But while you are doing that, I think, Riina, we might want to take some questions that you have pre-curated already to Melanie.
Yeah, I was thinking Riitta was asking an interesting question about empathy and compassion. Riitta, are you still online? Would you like to ask the question yourself?
Yes, I'm here. Hi, thank you. Sure. So just to give a brief context, I'm a behavioral designer and also a certified mindfulness facilitator. And combining sort of these two, I've been wondering, like before I've had this user empathy aspiration, if you will. And now I'm moving, maybe I'm sort of pondering if moving towards user compassion would be somehow more fruitful approach, namely that sometimes in empathy you can sort of jump into the same hole with the person you're feeling the empathy for. And then maybe if you're feeling compassion, you could understand what they are going through in a very deep level, and at the same time sort of keep your distance in a good sense, in a way that you can help them in what they are experiencing and feeling. Does this make sense? Maybe there's not a clear question in there, but this is something I've been pondering on. And Melanie, I would love to hear, what are your thoughts?
Thank you. Well, I actually would love to throw the question back at you, because I think that we're getting into definitions of words, right? What do we mean by empathy and what do we mean by compassion? And I think maybe I've kind of, see a little bit, I mean, they're quite close to each other, right? So it's maybe somebody actually calls it empathy and somebody calls it compassion. I think the important thing is the activation of, I think we can feel for someone, we can feel with someone. And I think it's important that we distinguish between, I feel that other persons, loss or difficult time, I feel terrible for them, but what do I actually do with this feeling? Is it just to kind of fuel my, is it staying within me, or am I actually doing something about it? So then I don't think it's so much about, which words we use, but it's actually about what you're doing about that feeling. I don't know how you would kind of see the difference as you've been thinking about it.
I agree with you totally. If I that it's the point is what you do with that. It's not so much in the words, but it's easy sort of to get caught in the terms, and it's easy to put two things against each other. Maybe
maybe I think sometimes, I mean, when we're in these design, I mean, it depends on in which space you're working in, but I think that if I take compassion as like, for example, if I am working in a social design project and I do research in a community and I use a compassionate approach, I think I would start helping. I would interview this woman and she said, like, I don't really have any food. And then I would go and buy her the food for dinner. And then I would run to the next house and there's a woman who doesn't have any clothes for the baby. And then I would think like, okay, maybe I should give her some clothes. And I think maybe that can be a bit dangerous. I think if we're in the moment there as a researcher, as part of, a process. So I think but then I understand when you do one-on-one kind of, mindfulness training, that's very important because you want to help that person in the situation. But I think then maybe how I see empathy then is a role is that there is a certain distance. Yes, I need to create and see that, okay, how do I, not kind of disappear myself in the process, and how start solving all these little problems for people. It's again an ethical question, should I give the person the food and should I give the person the baby clothes? Yes, so I don't know if that was an answer, but I think these are some questions that we need to be, thinking through. Totally.
Yes, thank you.
I'm looking at the schedule, Riina. I will put my screen share on, but you could take another one question from there. I think we have time for one more.
Then I'm gonna take the early birds who have been asking questions already quite in the, well, not in the beginning, but whilst Melanie was still speaking, and there was Hanna-Riitta who was pondering about the shorter term and longer term perspectives and combining those. So Hanna-Riitta, are you online?
Yes, I'm here. Okay, obviously you can hear me, I think.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, yeah, thank you first of all, Melanie, for a great presentation. Really, I mean, very, very good. Thanks a lot. Yeah, indeed, I was thinking about sort of understanding the sort of the complexity of problems and the wicked problems, and that the solutions take a long time, as you also said. But how do you sort of balance between then sort of making some, I mean, when you're engaging with communities and you hear them and you feel them and they expect maybe something. So sort of like balancing between sort of quick wins, like shorter term solutions to simple sort of partial problems or partial solutions for partial problems. And then at the same time, sort of working towards the structural solutions. So what's your sort of thinking around that?
Thank you. That's, I think, the $1 million question, right? And I think it's a very good question. But I would say I think it's kind of, yes, we need to keep like the big goal and the kind of structural thing in place. And I think as designers, we need to be designing for these two levels. We need, if we're in this long project, we need to design on the strategic level and communicating, you know, how what we learn in the community actually affects like more systemic change and that. But then I think, can we actually build into the design process little things that can kind of, you know, do things? And sometimes it is that you just create, you know, these are little ideas that you have while you're in the field and you're working with people and an idea comes up, you know, you might actually give it to another group and say that we have learned this, you know, could you do something about it? I think it's not also that you have the responsibility of solving all these problems, but can you invite maybe other stakeholders along the process that can take up little things? Like, for example, as part of one of our design kind of research projects, we had one, we involved local researchers in conducting research. And I think they got so inspired through the process and the topic that they actually funded their own little NGO to support the disabled people in their people with disabilities in their community. And so it was just this, like the way how we collaborated that actually brought them, you know, an idea for, hey, we can do something about the women that we talked to. And they started to go on their own and now they have their little 3 women NGO doing things. So I think it's kind of allowing some of these things to happen while keeping the big kind of piece on top. But still learning.
Okay, thanks. No, it's good to hear your sort of view on that. Thanks a lot.
I think we would have a ton of good questions in the queue as well, but we are beyond our time, which is okay by me. I can stay here for a couple of minutes longer. I still wanted to say a couple of words. We have an extra HERÄÄMÖ coming up. This was scheduled just last week. On the 1st of June, we have a Finnish-speaking HERÄÄMÖ coming up, and this is a little bit of a different concept. This is built upon our previous training program that was about the issues of urbanization and nature-based solutions to them. So what we will be doing is we will actually be looking at some of the outcomes and some of the results and discussion following from our previous training program called Sitra Lab 2. Now we are running on 3rd one, but we will be publishing this event soon enough, so you will have some additional information. At this point, I would invite the audience to turn on their microphones, as opposed to what I have instructed earlier. Turn on your microphones, please, all of you, and let's give Melanie a round of applause. I think that's a good point to stop. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this morning, and thank you, Melanie, for providing us with a great session. All of the materials will be available on Sitra website afterwards. So, again, thank you for joining us, and hope to see you all next time. Ciao.
Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you.
Saako häiritä? Oliko niin, että meillä jatkuu sit se suomenkielinen osio niin kuin 10.30 ja sitten varsinaisesti iltapäivä alkoi vasta 11.30?
Mä tsekkaan se aikataulu vielä ihan sekunti. Se on tullut. Ja nyt teille, jotka olette siellä vielä linjoilla, jotka ette ole mukana Sitra Labin koulutusohjelmassa, niin tällä hetkellä me jutellaan koulutusohjelman kavereiden kanssa.
Mä olin Jaakko ainakin siis ymmärtänyt, että seuraavaksi te vaan vedette suomeksi tämän aamupäivän. Jolloin, koska mä oon ollut tässä aamussa, niin mulle sitten seuraava ohjelma alkaa 11.30.
Joo, niin yes. Siis samaa mä kelasin kanssa.
Joo, just näin. Eli puolelta on semmoinen 40 minuuttia, me käydään läpi heille joilla niin toi englanti takeltelee, että saa myöskin tämän sisällä, mutta se on täysin vapaaehtoinen. Jos on ollut tässä, niin se on semmoinen niin kuin vesitetty versio tästä.
Joo, mutta 11.30 jatkuu sitten.
Yes.
Yes, hyvä.
Yes, okei.
Jatketaan.
Moi moi.
Mukavaa päivää. Kiitos tästä.
Kiitos.
Moi moi.
Melani taisi lähteä, eikö lähtenyt?
Joo, näyttää siltä. Me ollaan vielä livenä YouTubessa.
Pitäisikö